dissociation, flashbacks, extreme hypervigilance, and panic attacks, and issues with intimacy. Sometimes it's pelvic floor pain. A lot of people end up with autoimmune disorders over time. The thing with those overwhelming events and resources is when it happens, if you don't have the resources to get the help you need, the body has a way of knowing that's the case and pushing the traumatic event down, repressing or suppressing it. And that's why I end up seeing so many survivors 20, 30 years after they went through one or more assaults.
Welcome to Normalize the Conversation. I'm your host, Francesca Reigeter, and today I'm joined by Erika Shershun, a somatically trained licensed and marriage family therapist and author of Healing Sexual Trauma, a workbook, and Healing Sexual Trauma, a guided journal, helping survivors reconnect with their bodies, reclaim safety, and heal through a gentle body-centered approach. In this episode, we discuss the path to healing sexual trauma and reclaiming safety in your body. Join us as we talk about how writing, somatic practices, and boundary work can help survivors feel whole, empowered, and resilient. If you've ever wondered what true embodied healing looks like, this conversation is a powerful place to start.
Erika, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited about our conversation because as a therapist trainee, this is something we're going to talk about healing from sexual trauma that I feel like I didn't get a lot of education and support around. So I'm really excited and grateful for the opportunity to talk to you and learn from you. But before we begin, I want to check in. How are you really?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, I'm really doing well.
I'm happy to hear that because I'm just, again, really grateful for the chance to have this conversation with you. When it comes to trauma in general, I feel like I had one class on it that was trying to encompass so much in a very short time. It was like a summer class. And then when it comes to kind of like anything to do with sex therapy, we had like 8 hours of training on a Saturday, and then that was it. So this wasn't something that was talked about. And it's something that is so common. It's scary that I don't have that training yet. And knowing that maybe I should be exploring more options on how to get it.
Absolutely. And first of all, I want to say congratulations, Fran, on your graduation. That's an awesome accomplishment. And welcome to the profession. Yeah, it's very much lacking the amount of training on trauma and as well as sex therapy, which is a specialized field in itself. Trauma also, though, requires a lot of additional training beyond grad school. So it can be done in parallel with grad school, but it's really needed to treat trauma. It's so complex, the work. And so there's a lot of great modalities out there. I especially like the somatic-based modalities. They have a really good track record. So I think when people are looking for a therapist, it's important that they look on the website and see that they do have additional training in trauma work beyond their grad school degree. The grad schools are limited on what they can offer because they have to check a lot of boxes for the regulations. And unfortunately, they just don't get enough trauma training in there. One course is not going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I loved my school, loved my program, thought it was amazing. I do wish I had more, and it's really a shame that it's not part of like the regulations and requirements as well by the board. I feel like it should be. It's also such an individualized experience, right? The way we experience trauma is so different and unique to each of us. And how it appears, not just mentally, but also physically and in our bodies is so important, which is why that somatic work is so incredibly needed. Can you, first of all, explain maybe more about what trauma is and then also what somatic work is?
Yeah, so trauma can be seen as overwhelm to your system. I'm also training in a wonderful modality called organic intelligence that considers trauma a lack of resources. So sort of, the flip side of the overwhelm. The overwhelm to the system happens, we call it trauma after the fact. And that's because two people might experience a similar, say, a natural disaster, and one might be traumatized by it and another might not. And that does have to do with what resources they have available to them in the moment. So, and in the aftermath. So the overwhelm happens, then we're left with trauma. It's the somatic element so important because when we experience that overwhelm, our brain doesn't process the event in the same way that we are processing the rest of the time. So if we're experiencing neutral or pleasant event, like, a part that we feel comfortable at and welcome at, we're going to record that in our brain like a movie. When we experience trauma, it's encoded differently, and we don't have that replay where it plays back like a movie. Instead, it's predominantly stored in our implicit memory, and our implicit memory is emotional and procedural. So the procedural part of that is all body-based, somatic sensations, patterns of movement, that sort of thing. So that's why the somatic work is so important, because so much of the trauma is arising through the emotions and the sensation and other procedural movements. So when that happens, we often don't know why it's happening at first. A lot of people come to me who start to have these symptoms, and the trauma might have happened recently or it might have happened years ago, and they're overwhelmed with the symptoms showing up, and they're trying to understand, like, they might be getting flashbacks, flashes of memory, or even if they remember it, but the symptoms haven't shown up until now. It's really hard to wrap your head around what's happening to you at that time. And when we don't work with the trauma, sooner or later, it's going to happen where the symptoms are going to start showing up. Not the same symptoms for everyone, but it will at some point show up to be healed.
Yeah.
So the system wants to go toward healing. We want to heal.
Absolutely. And yeah, we all process it differently. And it really does show up whether we want it to or not. So being able to learn, first of all, to be able to find support that's right for you, resources that are right for you. Hopefully a therapist who has that training, who can support you. But I think a lot of people don't even register traumatic experiences as a form of trauma. So they kind of sweep it under the rug, and then these symptoms start happening. And because they never registered it as trauma, they invalidate it or think, oh, something's wrong with me. I'm just being dramatic. I don't know where this is coming from, really just downplaying all of it. So for people listening, what are some maybe common symptoms of trauma that we may overlook?
I think one of the most common is just being triggered and having your emotions go from 0 to 100 in a moment, and not really understanding why so you're feeling a little out of control in terms of your emotions. Like, it sort of overtakes you very quickly and it's uncomfortable. And in my experience, there's always a trauma under that. So there's so many symptoms with trauma that I put a big list together, and it's available on my healingsexualtrauma.com website. It's a blog post about symptoms. So I divided it into 6 categories, and we can get into that if you want. But in terms of, for survivors, the most common symptoms that drive people to seek help are, in my view, tend to be dissociation, flashbacks, extreme hypervigilance and panic attacks, and issues with intimacy. Sometimes it's pelvic floor pain, but that's certainly not the only issue that can come up. A lot of people end up with autoimmune disorders over time. The thing with those overwhelming events and resources is when it happens, if you don't have the resources to get the help you need, which by that I don't just mean external resources, but internal resources as well. But for instance, if you're a young child and doesn't feel safe to tell anyone what happened to you, there's no way you're going to get the resources you need to heal. So the body has a way of knowing that's the case and pushing the traumatic event down, repressing or suppressing it. And that can go on for years. And that's why I end up seeing so many survivors 20, 30 years after they went through one or more assaults. So, and that's why I said earlier, the symptoms are going to show up sooner or later, because what I see is when people have enough resources externally and internally to do the work of healing, the symptoms show up. So it doesn't necessarily feel like they have enough resources because it feels horrible when the symptoms start to show up, but their body is letting them know, like, it's time to do this work. The longer we go pushing it down, the more intense symptoms can develop. Another very common symptom is digestive issues like IBS, and along with that can be reproductive issues. And that has to do with the whole fight, flight, and freeze response coming on board, and that being present a lot in survivors who haven't been able to integrate their trauma yet.
All these physical symptoms often overshadow the trauma, right? So a lot of times we go and try to treat these physical symptoms. We try to treat the autoimmune disorders, the digestive issues, the reproductive issues, and we don't register that this can be because of trauma, and being able to heal can help us alleviate a lot of these symptoms. So where do people begin if maybe they're listening and they're like, you know what, I am having these physical symptoms, but I have experienced, sexual trauma. Is this connected? Where can they begin?
I think noticing what is there, like what is the combination of symptoms. So usually it's not just going to be an autoimmune disease that's showing up, but there'll be some hypervigilance, they're on edge all the time, or they're dissociating. Yeah, not everyone goes through flashbacks, but another very common symptom is nightmares showing up, but not every survivor gets any combination of these symptoms. So it's different with each case. But in my everyone I've worked with who has autoimmune disease, they do have trauma at the base of it. Same thing with addiction. I mean, I don't tend to work with addiction specifically, but I've worked with people who've already gotten into recovery, and I've worked with quite a few people in that position, and there's always trauma there. It may not be sexual trauma, but there might be neglect and other types of trauma. So yeah, I can't think of a client I've ever worked with where we didn't find some trauma to heal. So I think maybe just approaching it as a given that there is some type of trauma here that I would benefit from clearing, given that my body is creating these symptoms that it's trying to get my attention with.
And then on the other side, for a therapist, right? How can a therapist begin to explore where there is trauma?
I start out with asking clients what they'd like to see happen in therapy. It's usually going to be right there, like what they want to see change. So one of the things that happens with trauma is that we take in beliefs about ourselves that are negative, and they stay there until a therapist or some other modality, some other type of professional works with them who is skilled at creating a memory reconsolidation. So in EMDR, we have a long list of these negative beliefs, and it looks like this. It's called the greatest hits list of negative cognition. And so when a trauma happens, we take in beliefs such as I am permanently damaged, I am defective, I am worthless. Um, or it could be something like I have done something wrong, or I cannot trust anyone. Often people coming in for therapy will hint at those negative beliefs in the very first session and why they're there. In my work, I believe three things are needed on the therapist's part to help the client heal. And that is integration of the trauma, the memory reconsolidation, and the releasing of trapped emotion. So I think there's just so many tells. I think the therapist's intuition is an important piece to bring in. I definitely pick up on a lot that way about what someone's presenting with. And then I ask them, and because the client's the expert on themselves. So I want to run it by them, what I'm picking up on, and it's usually pretty spot on. At the same time, I don't ever pressure anyone to tell the trauma story. With some clients, it's better for them to start with something not as intense as, say, a sexual trauma. And with others, they want to dive right into it. So either way is okay. I find that clearing up the sexual trauma clears up more symptoms than anything else.
I had one client that it took over 20 sessions for her to talk about trauma. It was actually our direct observation session. I was like, oh no. But that was the first time that she got to a place where she felt comfortable talking about it because one, a young girl hasn't had a lot of opportunity to talk about the physical trauma or sexual trauma that she went through. And anytime she has, maybe that kind of rejection, right? Or that invalidation, a therapist not knowing what to say, not giving her space to finish sharing and talking, especially what she's going through, had made it so difficult to find that sense of trust. So being, I think, willing as a therapist to know it may not come out right away, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and really paying attention and being open to continuously learning and exploring at the client's pace is so important. And then another thing you brought up that I really appreciated was those core beliefs, right? That we might have, because for me, when I restarted therapy, beginning of this year, my therapist asked, like, where does that come from? Where is this feeling of, I constantly say like, oh, but that was my fault, right? I did this to myself. So I'm constantly saying that over and over again. And she's like, where does that come from? Like, let's go back to one of the first times you thought that. And really going back to like, Fran, that's trauma, right? That was a traumatic experience that you went through. That was not safe. That was not normal. That was not something that you should have gone through in your childhood. Are you comfortable talking about it? And that was the first time I registered it as something that I went through and not something that was my fault.
Yeah, it's so important. It's just not easy to turn those beliefs around because they're so deep in our subconscious. And it's such an important piece of the work. And EMDR is really good because it takes care of two of those three things, the integration and the memory reconsolidation, which when you get what we call target, what we're working on, down to neutral, it's neutralized. So in other words, you're no longer going to get triggered when you think about it or you're reminded of it or you're talking about it. At the same time, this new memory will take the place of that negative belief organically. You'll just have this new belief that is a positive belief. And it's a beautiful thing. That I think really is life-changing for people to no longer have, every time they get dysregulated, to no longer have that thought of I'm worthless or whatever else is coming up for them. It's sad that we take these things on, and it starts as young as 15 months old when shame comes on in toddlers. If shame happens and there's no repair, then that little toddler is going to think I'm bad or I'm inadequate or I'm worthless. And if it keeps happening over and over again, that becomes a very strong belief and self-concept. And And changing that is so amazing. And then, it continues as we get older. Infants and toddlers, I think it's not until around 3 or 4 where a child can even grasp that one person can be both good and bad. So it's too overwhelming to think that a caregiver is bad because you're dependent on them for everything, for your survival. So rather than putting it out there on, oh, my parent or caregiver is bad, I'm bad, I must be bad. That's not as overwhelming to think as they're bad and how am I going to survive? And again, they can't grasp that they could be good and do something bad. And then as we get older, we continue it because we feel this sense of control. If it's me who's bad, then I can do something about it. Right. But if everyone out there, I don't know who is bad, I'm limited in what I can do about it. So you can see why we take on these beliefs, but they really get embedded in us, and changing them is quite helpful.
Yeah. Oh, that if I'm bad, right? That sense of control, then I can fix me.
Yes.
That's a big thing for me, right?
Yeah.
Always wanting to find that solution. If I can fix me, then everything will be okay.
But
And
it work.
it doesn't work. And I wish it worked. My life would be so much easier if it worked.
Yeah. Because it's a flawed concept to begin with, right? Like, and you making yourself bad all the time is actually quite harmful to you.
This is the lecture my therapist gives me every session. I'm like, one day I'll get it, I swear. Like, logically, I feel like I get it. Emotionally, not there yet. And it's so sad because then at least for me, I can say, I'll speak from my own experience, that it creates this sense of shame. And then I shouldn't talk about it. And then I internalize it. And it just fuels this cycle over and over again that something's wrong with me. Something's wrong with me. I need to fix me. And it's harming those relationships as well, where that trauma exists, because I always refer to myself as a masochist, which my therapist hates. But I'm like, I keep putting myself in these situations thinking it's going to change because I'm going to change me. And no matter how much I try to change myself, if I'm not accepting that the way that they're speaking to me or behaving toward me is not okay, then I'm just continuing this cycle and then feeling like this is my fault, and then going into this kind of place where I'm retreating and feeling all this shame. How did I let this happen to me? What is wrong with me, over and over again?
And shame is one of the most painful emotions, if not the most painful emotion. And because of that, it's often buried under other emotions because it's so, so painful. What I see a lot is that quite a few survivors turn against themselves with these thoughts. And in that sense, they become their own perpetrator. They're hurting themselves over and over again. And they're giving themselves the message they got over and over again growing up, whether it was directly from a parent or from somewhere else. So when people think about that, usually they're, a little shocked to realize how much they've been hurting themselves and start to realize they don't want to hurt themselves that way.
I spent so many years like preventing myself from being able to love myself, which feels so sad looking back at it now, how much I like beat myself up and convinced myself that I hated myself and kept going and going with that narrative. And to finally get to a point where it's like, okay, we can talk about it, right? I'm not too much for feeling this way. I'm overwhelmed. I'm feeling alone. I'm feeling hurt, but it's not on me, right? And what is on me is taking the time to give myself space, to give myself grace, and go to therapy and do the work outside of therapy, because that's where a lot of it happens. And that's one thing I really want to talk about is your journal and workbook, because I love like workbooks and worksheets and all that stuff outside of therapy, because that couple hours a week is so great. It really is. But a lot of the work is happening those 23 other hours of the day. So having a guide that can really help me explore more of what this means to me, right? How I'm experiencing it, going through it, creating those insights, and then being able to bring them into the therapy room is very, very helpful.
I ask all of my clients to do eventually 5 core practices, and one of them is self-compassion. It's such an important practice to develop, and it can be very hard in the beginning for some people. I mean, I've had people who can't take it in at all in the beginning, but with practice, they'll get there and be able to take it in. And it is in addition to the memory reconsolidation, it is the way to turn around that negative self-talk. It is the way to nurture feelings of shame, to be able to heal that. When we take shame in from someone else, I mean, when we take compassion in from others, it's just harder to take it in from others. We first and foremost have to be able to take it in from ourselves. So learning self-compassion is a requirement, in my view, to work with those negative beliefs and self-talk. It's really, I think, the only way to turn them around, to truly turn them around on a not just here, but your whole being.
And it becomes very difficult to trust other people when they're being nice, right? And they're being kind. You're like, what's the motive here? Why are they being nice to me? That's a big one that that comes up for me a lot, right? And it's like when I can't offer any compassion to myself, I'm convinced that I don't deserve it. So then anytime someone is nice to me, I'm like, why are they being nice to me? And it's very difficult. Or I crave that kind of like validation and kindness from others and never give it to myself, and just I feed off of it. And then when it's not there, I like spiral.
Most people are much better at giving it to others. So, some of the best practices for self-compassion start with thinking of what you would say to someone you love and then giving that to yourself. A lot of people have struggled with taking it in because somatically they've learned since the time they were very young to constrict around their heart. If a baby, the only thing it can do to protect or try to protect itself is constrict its muscles. Refuse food is one way it can have power. So those things don't really protect the baby, but it's what choice do they have? Nothing else they can do. So we can learn that from the time we're an infant to constrict around our heart center. And there's a term called heart wall or shield, and it really feels like we develop a shield around our heart if that's a pattern that we've gotten used to doing. And of course, we're not consciously thinking, I want to create a wall around my heart, but that wall, it makes it hard to receive compassion from ourselves or from anyone else. So we can be giving compassion, but we're having a really hard time receiving it. So with practice, that will start to crack or dissolve, however you want to think of it. But a lot of people actually do get an image at some point of that wall around their heart who've been doing that pattern. It's quite common. So that's part of why it can be really hard to take in at first. So again, it goes back to like it's in the body too. It's not just your thoughts that we're working on here.
That's why the somatic work is so, so important. It's really heartbreaking how hard it is to give ourselves that compassion. And I know it's really difficult when you get to that awareness of like, I am so good at giving compassion to other people. I go out of my way to help people all the time. Why can't I just say one kind thing to myself? And that's something I know personally I've been working on and challenging a lot is like, what's one nice thing I like about myself? And when I can't come up with anything, I actually text my friends and I'm like, okay, what's one reason that you love me? Like, what's one nice thing you can say to me? Like, what are 3 words you can use to describe me? And thankfully, they're all used to me sending them those texts and they respond so like quickly and nicely, and they realize how much it helps me. But when I can't think of it myself, getting it from other people and then saying it to myself and trying to see why they see me that way. And kind of forcing myself to give myself that compassion has been very, very helpful.
That's a great practice, to hear why others love you or what qualities they like in you. And also what I mentioned earlier, just thinking, if a friend came to me feeling what I'm feeling right now, what would I say to them? What kind words would I give them? How would I be kind? And to bring touch into it. So it doesn't have to be on the heart center, but some type of touch, which is going to feel calming to your nervous system. And, when we have these super uncomfortable feelings, it's usually because our nervous system is in a dysregulated state. So calming it is important to prioritize. So bringing in the touch and the kind words that you would say to someone else can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, if you're so good at giving it to others, being able to kind of reframe it, if a friend asked me, like, what would I say, is so powerful. And being able to create that calming touch for your body, that's so powerful. There was someone taught me to just do this. And I'm not one to physical touch. I'm very much I feels like my skin is crawling when someone touches me without me initiating it. So learning to just kind of create that calmness for myself and that sense of safety and almost a hug has been so helpful in finding what works for you and knowing that it might be different for you than it is for other people, and that's okay.
Yeah, and the touch can even just be your hands touching, the other. Um, there's a lot of them. Like, some people respond to that. Some the hug, maybe your abdomen, one hand on the heart, one on the abdomen. Um, so it could be any combination, but just some form of touch really helps. And it's different than someone else touching us, and that should always be with consent.
It should be. As we are wrapping up, what's one last piece of advice maybe for someone who's listening who has experienced some form of sexual trauma and hasn't gotten to that place of being able to even start with self-compassion? What's one piece of advice to help them get started on their healing journey?
The most piece of advice is for them to start doing what's called orienting and start looking outside of them when they feel dysregulated, meaning that their nervous system's been thrown into fight, flight, or freeze, also known as sympathetic or dorsal vagal. When uncomfortable feelings and emotions and sensations are coming up for them, that's a sign that they're in a dysregulated state. And if they can look around them, in both my books, I have a practice called coming into safety or presence in the first chapter. And also that's available online to download from the workbook for free at healingsexualtrauma.com. So the practice is at the end of the first chapter. A piece of it is orienting. So in that practice, I have you turn your head and neck all the way to one side and then scan the room you're in at a very slow pace. That's one way to do it, but you can also just let your eyes fall wherever they want. But the idea is you're taking in something outside of yourself. When we stay within our thoughts, our system will pick up on fear and keep us in a dysregulated state because it doesn't distinguish if the fear is an actual threat out there or if we're just having fearful thoughts. So that it's some sort of fear that's already taken us into the dysregulated state, even if we're not aware of what that is or that fear is present, but it is. That's why we've become dysregulated. And to come out of it, we want to let our system take in that, hey, there's actually not a real present moment threat to your life happening right now. If there is, you've got to do something about that. But otherwise, like let your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system take in, it's actually around me, it's okay. I'm relatively safe in this moment. You're letting your amygdala take that in, and your system can start to move into a regulated state. So to me, that's the most important thing for them to start to do. Next, I would certainly suggest looking into therapy if they're open to it. And there are low fee clinics if they can't afford therapy for them to look into, and other resources. They can always email me through the websites if they are having a hard time knowing how to go about that.
That is amazing advice. Thank you so much for joining me today. Can you tell people where they can buy your books?
They can buy them in any major bookstore, the independent bookstores as well, of course, Amazon, and it has the 5 core practices in it that I think all survivors benefit. Honestly, I think anyone benefits from it. They're really like life practices, and they don't take a lot of time to do. So yeah. So there, and then again, the healingsexualtrauma.com.
Thank you so much for listening to Normalize the Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. This podcast is an initiative of Inspiring My Generation, focusing on normalizing the conversation, bringing education and awareness to the forefront, and amplifying global voices to spark change and hope. Inspiring My Generation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization on a mission towards suicide prevention through awareness, conversation, education, and support. Connect with us on Instagram at Inspiring My Generation and visit our website inspiringmygeneration.org to learn more about our work and how you can make a difference.